89.3 and 88.5 Yes FM. Online at www.yeshome.com. Now on the free Yes FM iTunes app and the Yes FM Android app, or the free TuneIn Radio app. Search Yes FM Lima.
Ray, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you.
It's good to talk to you. This is a fascinating book because you do one of the things, I mean, there's obviously tons of book about biblical prophecy and lots of different views about Revelation and understandings of the end times.
Right.
But not a lot of them actually deal with, you know, the history of Israel in modern times and the people that are there and the different people that occupy that land. And you kind of delve into that in your book. Why did you take that approach as you approach the idea of end times?
Well, you know, I've been a pastor and gone to Israel, taken tours, and basically I was there one time, and I felt like the Lord, you know, was speaking to me and just saying, hey, you know, you look at Israel like a clock on the wall, and the Lord said, this is people, and these are my people, going all the way back to Abraham, you know, who had both Isaac and Ishmael. And all the problems that are going on right now in many ways go back to those two sons, both of whom Abraham loved with a deep, you know, love and a great passion. God had promised a blessing to Isaac with 12 tribes, but he also had given a blessing to Ishmael that he would have 12 princes, make him a great nation as well. So the Lord was saying, get off the bus and start getting to know the people. I was in Nazareth. You know, we got off the bus in Nazareth where Jesus was raised. And usually, you know, there's not a lot to see there. And so, you know, you get off the bus, there's a church where they've built around a well that, you know, goes back to ancient times. Surely Jesus and his parents would have come here. And then you get back on the bus and take off. But I was introduced to a man named Boutros, which is Arabic for Peter. And one of the assistants who was with me says, man, you got to come meet this guy. So I came and introduced myself, and Boutros said, yeah, Ray Bentley, you're with Maranatha Chapel and part of Calvary Chapel. I've heard of you and your group. You love Israel. You come and bless the Jews. You bring all these tourists, and you visit the ancient stones of Israel, but you don't visit the living stones. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, I'm an Arab. He goes, I am an Arab, Christian, Palestinian, Israeli. And I said, excuse me? He goes, I'm a minority within a minority within a minority within a minority. You know, he told me, I asked him, because he's a lawyer. He's extremely, intelligent. He speaks, English, Arabic, and Hebrew fluently. I said, how did you get saved? And it was a funny story. He goes, I got saved when I was in junior high school. There was a Lebanese professional wrestler who came through, Nazareth to the Baptist church where he was, and he would get so mad and violent, he would break pulpits when he preached. So Boutros and his friends really came not to hear the gospel. They came to see this guy kind of go nuts and, and destroy a pulpit. And the guy preached some hellfire brimstone message, and then gave the gospel, but Boutros got saved. Now he's grown up, and he oversees the Nazareth Baptist School. It's 1,000 students. It's a private Christian school, and 200 of the kids come from Muslim families. And this is with chapel and with everything else. They hear about Jesus, but they come because it's the best school in the area. So when I met Boutros, which is Arabic for Peter, I just said, Boutros, I am so sorry. We didn't even know you guys existed. And so I said, we need to become friends. And so it kind of launched me into a whole new area. Now I can say I have a friend who is an Arab, Christian, Palestinian, Israeli, and we began a relationship over 10 years ago. It's been incredible.
Well, not many people can say that.
No. And the funny thing is, my view of prophecy is that, Israel became a nation again. It's a fulfillment of a 2,500-year-old prophecy from Ezekiel. and God gave the land to Israel and to the Jewish people, and Boutros is kind of like, we don't really quite see it that way, and he told me, look, if you read the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2, and Peter preaches the gospel, and all these different groups, he goes, I don't know if you've noticed, one of the groups listed there is the Arabs. He goes, we've been here in Jerusalem since the day of Pentecost, the birth of the church, believing and following Jesus in Jerusalem for 2,000 years. He goes, and many people don't realize Arab believers and Jesus were here 700 years before Muhammad even came along.
Right.
And we've been forgotten. It's like we don't even exist. And I said, well, you know what, Boutros? I'm going to bring your story to as many people as I can. So that's one of the purposes I had in the book. And there's many other stories like that.
And I think it's a great point, because when we hear about, goings on in the Middle East, it's always the Jews and the Arabs, the Jews and the Muslims. And,
right.
And the Christians, both Jewish Christians and Arab Christians, they kind of, who are our brothers and sisters in Christ,
yes,
they kind of get lost in the mix.
Yes, exactly. And there's a very touching story, because there's a great movement going on among the Jewish believers, the Messianic Jews. Right now, there's probably, the best estimate is about 15,000 Jewish believers in Jesus. And, culturally, this is a huge thing. Many of the Orthodox say you cannot be Jewish and believe in Jesus, which is kind of funny, because Jesus was Jewish, all the apostles were Jewish, and yet they were followers of Jesus as the Messiah. So, but they've kind of reached critical mass now in Israeli modern society, and much of the media, which, is kind of liberal, they say, what, look, these guys, we now have this second, third generation of kids that grow up, they join the military, which they have to do for 2 years, both guys and girls. They become doctors, lawyers. They live a totally Jewish life and culture and raise their kids that way, and they also believe Jesus is the Messiah. I mean, they've reached critical mass where they're almost being, by more and more people in the society, they're accepted as being both Jewish, but at the same time believing in Jesus. So, there was a touching story where there was a little girl, I think she might have been a teenager, and she wanted to get baptized, and her parents, were very proud of her. She wanted to identify with Jesus, but was from an Arab family. And she told her parents, but I want to be baptized by a Jewish Messianic rabbi. And the parents were like, oh no, so they brought it to the elders of the church, and that turned into a big, Middle Eastern discussion, which, if you know Middle Eastern culture, means there's a lot of yelling and shouting, and but at the end of it, somebody said, maybe we ought to, instead of arguing about it, pray. So the elders prayed, and when they prayed, the Lord told them, this is of me. And stories like that, where this girl came and all the Arab community and then the Messianic community came together and came to the place of baptism, and it was a Jewish Messianic rabbi who baptized this young Arabic girl, and it's very touching. God's doing some powerful healing things that I think are lights and example, not only to Israel, but to the body of Christ around the world.
And you talked to, obviously, some just kind of men on the street, but also you had the opportunity to talk to people like Benjamin Netanyahu, Joel Rosenberg, who we've interviewed here on the show before. What was that like to sit down, with someone like Benjamin Netanyahu and speak with him? Well,
that's another interesting story. I met this guy who was from, actually, Africa originally, and from Zimbabwe, what used to be called Rhodesia, in South Africa. And his dad was actually working in a hotel when John G. Lake came through from, who got saved in, the revival in Azusa Street in the early, 20th century. And when John G. Lake walked into the hotel, all these people started yelling and screaming. Some people got healed. Other people, demons were cast out of them. And Robert's father said, man, he was raised a Methodist. He goes, we don't see stuff like this. So he got radically saved, and then his son got saved and had many miraculous things take place in his life. But he ended up coming to Australia. So here's this black African from South Africa who goes to Australia for Bible college, meets an Australian, a white Australian wife, and while he's there, God says, now I want you to go to Texas. Dallas, Fort Worth.
Of course.
So, of course, right? This is
like
God.
You would do, yeah.
Exactly. So you've got a black African married to a white Australian. They're in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. He talks with this thick accent, and he walks around with a cowboy hat. And he was at a basically all-white church where he was the assistant pastor of about 150 people. And God tells him to leave the church. I have called you to deliver a personal word to the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. So he ends up doing that. His wife thinks he's crazy, and he goes, Lord, I'm from Africa, and you've done many wonderful things, but I don't know, how am I going to do this? I come from a small church. God says there will be a man who will come and put his hand upon your shoulder, and he will say, the hour has come for you to deliver a message to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So sure enough, that happens. A guy comes up, puts his hand on Robert's shoulder, and says, the hour has come. I know that you have been praying, and God has called you to deliver a word. So long story short, my friend Robert Mulwary goes to Israel, is introduced to the then Prime Minister. This was when he was the first time the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And he basically delivers a message to him saying, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is telling you that if you go back on your word, he will personally remove you from office. And Benjamin Netanyahu kind of laughs, and he looked at Robert and he goes, do you know what we do over here in Israel to prophets whose words don't come to pass? He goes, you ever heard of stonings? And so anyway, he kind of laughed it off. And shortly thereafter, the Prime Minister came to America. This was when Bill Clinton was president and went to Camp David. And anyway, he ends up flying back to Israel, and he goes back on his word on something he had promised. And within a couple of weeks, he is removed from office. Mm. Fast forward a little while later, and Benjamin Netanyahu is with his wife, Sarah. Robert Mulwary was back in the land of Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu points to Robert and says, there's the man that told me what would happen if I went back on my word. So anyway, I was getting involved with this city in Ariel, and had sent a couple of assistant pastors over there to check it out. It's a city in the West Bank. I had met the mayor there, named Ron Nachman. So anyway, I get a call from these guys, and they said, you'll never guess who's here that we're having lunch with. I said, who? They said, the former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. I said, wow. And they said, and guess what he wants to do? And I said, I don't know what. He wants to speak at a Calvary Chapel of Fort Lauderdale. And that's the group that my church is part of, is Calvary Chapel. And I go, Benjamin Netanyahu wants to speak to Calvary Chapel? They go, yeah. So I call my friend Bob Coy, who is the pastor of Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale. It's one of the largest churches in the country. I don't know, they got 20,000 plus people. And I said, hey, Bob, he's got a crazy sense of humor. I said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, wants to come and preach at your church. And Bob, he's a really funny guy, and we're always teasing each other. He goes, oh, Ray, that's great, because I got Mother Teresa next week, I got the Pope the week after that, and then I got Billy Graham coming. I think we can fit him in. It took me 15 minutes before he finally said, are you serious? I go, yeah. I said, it's going to be insane. There's going to be CIA there, Mossad. It would be crazy. So anyway, it all happens. And I fly out to Fort Lauderdale to this church that's, got this big lighted cross in the back. It's huge congregation and sanctuary. And I fly with Robert Mulwary. And, Benjamin Netanyahu is just minutes away from walking out. It's packed. There's all this security and all these Mossad guys, walking around. There's helicopters above. There's media that are inside the sanctuary, and there's all these rabbis and Jewish people in this Christian church, kind of staring, looking around, going, "What in the world? What are we doing here?" And just before Benjamin Netanyahu came out to speak, Robert leans over to him and he goes, "Hey, the Lord gave me another word for the prime minister." And I was like, "Oh no, not now, Robert," And but he leans quietly over to the prime minister, and I kind of, lean in with him. And he says, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wants you to know that he has called you in the near future to be the prime minister of Israel for a second time, for an extremely prophetic hour." And then he gave him Joshua chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, "Be strong, be of good courage, I'll be with you," etc. And the prime minister this time didn't joke, he didn't laugh, he just kind of smiled, nodded his head, and then walked into that sanctuary full of Jews and Christians and media and delivered a message that was powerful. And he knew the history of Christians and Jews and how Christians had been instrumental even in the rebirth of Israel, and that this was an unusual hour where Jews and Christians are coming together. And it was a powerful message. You can go online and listen to it through the church there at Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale. But anyway, several years later, all of a sudden, Benjamin Netanyahu runs again, a second time. And here he is, right now, the prophecy having come true. And I give some more details of exactly what Robert shared with him in the new book I've written called The Holy Land Key. And you can go to theholylandkey.com and get more information on it. But it's an exciting, powerful, dramatic story. And I think that we're in one of the most exciting hours of human history.
And in your book, we've kind of talked a lot about the personal stories because I think that's such a unique factor of your book, but you also talk about how science is influencing this, how we're seeing prophecy through science, through religious traditions, through the patterns in creation and the seasons. A lot of areas that don't necessarily get covered in a lot of end times books. Yes.
Yeah, well, there's something that is about to happen in April, which is April 15th. Everybody, when I say April 15th, you think, oh, tax day.
Yeah.
But actually, April 15th this year is also Passover. And there's something that is very unusual that is confirmed by NASA, has a website with all the lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, going back a couple of thousand years and then on into the future. Well, I learned from one of my Jewish friends, Mark Biltz, he's a Jewish pastor, that God said in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, that he gave the lights of the firmament, which is the sun and the moon and the stars, for signs and seasons. Well, the word signs means signals. It can mean signals. So I'm thinking, how are the sun, moon, and the stars signals? Well, it says signs and seasons. I used to think seasons there in Genesis 1:14 meant summer, spring, winter, and fall. But the Hebrew word actually means divine festivals or appointments, the feasts of the Lord, which are, Christ was crucified on Passover. He was resurrected on the Feast of First Fruits. The Pentecost, Holy Spirit fell on Pentecost, etc. So the 7 feasts of Leviticus 23 are the 7 feasts. There's 4 in the spring and 3 in the fall. The 4 in the spring speak of the first coming. The 3 in the fall speak of the second coming. And it just so happens that this Passover, April 15th, on the first day of Passover, is a total lunar eclipse or a red moon. Mm. And on the last feast, the 7th feast in the fall, Tabernacles, it also begins with a total lunar eclipse or a red moon. The following year, in 2015, Passover, kind of the beginning of God's calendar, the biblical calendar, is also a total red moon. And then the last feast in the fall, again, Tabernacles, is a total red moon. So it's 4 red moons in a row, and they all land exactly on the first feast and the 7th feast 2 years in a row. So again, my friend Mark Piltz goes, wow, this can't be a coincidence. When was the last time that there were 4 blood moons 2 years in a row on the first feast and on the 7th feast? And when he went back, it went to 1967 and 1968. And most people, that know the Bible would say immediately and know history, wow, that's the 6-Day War.
Yep.
And that's when, Israel and 5 Arab nations got into a war. And it sounds insane. How do you have a war that lasts only 6 days in modern times? But it happened, and they cried out for a ceasefire. But by the end of it, Israel had gained the Golan Heights to the north, the West Bank along the Jordan River, the Gaza Strip in the south, but more importantly, East Jerusalem, which had been a divided city, was now completely in modern Israeli hands for the first time in 2,000 years, and they gained East Jerusalem. That's where the Temple Mount is, the Garden Tomb. All of the holy sites are in East Jerusalem, and that's what the world's been fighting about ever since then. So you had 4 red moons basically following that war in 1967, 1968. So we're going, wow, when was the last time before that there were 4 blood moons? And it goes back to 1949 and 1950, immediately following May 14th, 1948, when Israel became a nation, which is a 2,500-year-old prophecy, Ezekiel 37, that came to pass. So it's like, wow, the Talmud says that a red moon or a lunar eclipse is a sign or omen about the Jewish people. It's almost like God uses lunar eclipses as signs or signals. Something divinely providential is happening or prophetic on the earth. Mm-hmm. So if you go back, there were no red moons, no 4 red moons in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, or the 1500s. You have to go back to 1493 and 1494. There were 4 blood moons 2 years in a row on Passover and Tabernacles. Well, what did that follow? It followed 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That's what I remember from school. And what happened in 1492 is that King Ferdinand and Isabella from Spain in 1492 kicked out all of the Jews from Spain. That started a 500-year migration where, a big percentage of Jews would end up in America, and another big percentage would make their way through Europe and eventually, after World War II, land back in Israel and back to modern times. So here we have these 4 red moons. It's only happened 3 times in the last 500 years, and every time it's happened, something major has happened to the Jewish people and to Israel, and the prophetic clock is swung forward, and it's happening starting this year in 2014, April 15th, over the next 2 years.
Wow.
So without predicting, I don't think we should predict what's going to happen, but the pattern has been right on the button that I think we could at least anticipate something major is about to occur in the Middle East, in particular with the Jewish people. And by the way, these 4 red moons that are coming in the next 2 years, that doesn't happen for the rest of the 21st century. So a lot of exciting things that I talk about in the book, The Holy Land Key.
Ray Bentley joining us, The Holy Land Key, Unlocking End Times Prophecy Through the Lives of God's People in Israel. Hey, Ray, thanks so much for joining us. We're running up against the clock here, but we really appreciate your time with us this morning. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you. It's been great being with you.
And God bless.
God bless.
That is Ray Bentley. Once again, the book is The Holy Land Key and Unlocking End Times Through the End Times Prophecy Through the Lives of God's People in Israel. And you can check that out, Amazon and all the places where Christian books are stolen.
Yes, FM.